So we're going to get started with our next session, which is catastrophe. We're going to talk about catastrophe. No, but realistically, so we're here for the most part to talk about moving to phishing-resistant authentication. But the grand utopia of being phishing-resistant, across the board is something that takes a journey. There is the journey into implementing phishing-resistant authentication, and then there's the period where you have it, but you probably already you'll also have like backup authentication methods, and that could be phishable and things like that. And so, to kind of help talk about or inform you about like how to protect yourself when you're still in this interim period is Atul from Signal, who, excuse me, who is the person for this, and every year is, I get the best feedback about, Atul speaking about, these kinds of protections when, you have authentication methods that could potentially get you into some danger. So please help me to welcome Atul from Signal to talk to you about that.
Thank you, Megan. All right. Feel like a rock star with the handheld mic, so I went for that. So yeah, just a couple of things about myself. You can think of my career as sort of the first half when I helped sort of open doors, help people log in by defining or help define federated identity and SAML and all those things. And the second part of my career is where I'm trying to close doors and helping people log out using like shared signals and CAPE standards and all that, right? So you might know me from my work in the OpenID Foundation in that regard, or IETF. So, but I'm the CTO of Signal. That's what pays my bills. And I'm talking a little bit about sort of how do you protect yourself even though you might have like strong authentication. So let's jump right into it. All right, so we are, everyone in this room pretty much is going to be, busy trying to solve this authentication problem, right? We are trying to implement phishing resistance and, doing passkeys, maybe even MFA with passkeys and all that, right? So all that is great, but, is that sufficient, right? I think the problem is going to be that even if you have the strongest authentication, you'll still have insiders who have, malintent. You might still run into things where, tokens get stolen. You might have problems like, social engineering where even, reasonable employees will take unreasonable actions. And you finally have this problem that somebody makes a mistake, right? You have had situations where companies have lost millions and millions of dollars just because people, somebody misconfigured the wrong, cloud infrastructure or something like that. Right? So to prevent all this, you need to do a little better. And if you look into why authentication fails, it's really because you have a lot of access among all your employees. And most hackers today don't break in, they log in. They log in as your employees. And as a result, what happens is, you don't know whether it's an attacker or an employee. And, obviously, there's the mistake part that I talked about. So, this slide might feel a little dramatic, like, it's game over because right now, the way things work, there is a lot of access. Everyone has a lot of access. And that might result in, ransomware and, all kinds of things, all kinds of bad things. And, you probably know about all of these attacks. You've read in the news about them. All of these, like the famous quote, I think, is that a 10-minute call to this organization, had them lose $100 million, right? Because they were able to socially engineer the identity of a critical person. And the attackers will target the most critical resources. They'll look at the LinkedIn, they'll make sure that they're targeting the right identities that will give them the most access. So even if you believe that you have reasonable access controls for most of your employees, it's the places where matter is what these attackers are going to go after, right? So the current technology that we use, right? Typically, you have ACLs at the very highest levels, who can define the rest of your access controls. But then mostly you're using role-based access control. You're organized into roles or groups and things like that. And now you're also doing dynamic access control using attribute-based and all that, right? So, but the problem is that this is all based on sort of static properties, right? So you're not able to dynamically, automatically figure out who needs to have access to what. And because you're doing static access control, the principle that you're applying is least privilege, right? But the problem is that least privilege is really difficult to achieve, and I'll tell you why. So take a situation where you have a large number of applications. You might say, to have least privilege, I'm going to have a small number of roles, and I'm going to have those roles have access to all these different applications. What's going to happen is all these roles are going to be populated with all kinds of people that that need access to certain applications. Well, you might say, I'll create specialized roles for each application. Now you have a large number of roles that you have to manage. And then you are maybe having some situations where you're creating temporary permissions and all those things. So as a result, what you end up with is basically privilege sprawl, right? It becomes really hard to manually manage all of these things, right? So the fundamental problem that we think we should be solving is that we should not have to rely on manual processes in order to achieve least privilege, or in order to achieve sort of the right amount of access for each person. So the solution to this is a new way of thinking, and Ian Glazer has published an excellent article about this called zero standing privilege. Least privilege is a fallacy. What you really need is zero standing privilege. Basically, what you should be able to do is just leave your employees' credentials out on the street and not have to worry about that constituting a catastrophic compromise of your enterprise, right? And that's achievable. And so the rest of this talk is going to be, how do you do that, right? You're already running your business on a large number of systems that codify your business processes, right? So these are what I would call systems of record, right? So this could be, anything from your HR system, which has the latest information about who's working in which department, which team, who's the manager, et cetera, et cetera. You will have things like, pager duty, which will tell you who's on call at any given time. The HR system, by the way, will also tell you who's on leave at any given time. And there are sort of implicit policies that you believe in that, hey, if an employee is on leave, they should not be accessing a critical cloud system, right? Or you have the CRM system which tells you which customer service agent may be assigned to a case that belongs to a certain customer, right? So you know that relationship from your systems of record. Same thing with your ticketing system, where you may have an ITSM system, and you know which engineer should be having access to which critical resources, because they are working on something that needs that access at that particular point of time. So this is the information which is already present in your environment, and that is what you should be able to leverage in order to provide access, right? So the problem is that this information is messy. It needs correlation between all these different systems, independent systems that you have. There may be different latency and availability properties because of which you won't be able to readily leverage this information. And so while this is possible, it needs a little bit of work, right? And once you've done that, now you have achieved access, just-in-time access dynamically based on the knowledge in your organization to who should have access to which critical system at any given point of time. So going back for a second, what I can talk about is, let's say an SRE is assigned to a ticket that requires access to a certain part of your cloud service like AWS or something like that. Not all the resources, just a specific few resources. All that information can be gleaned from your systems of record, and only that access can be provided to that SRE. Now, once you've provided that access, that access control today is typically going to be enforced at the time of login, right? Because the identity provider is going to come in and they're going to decide what roles to include in the OIDC token or the SAML token that needs to go to the cloud service. But now that the user is logged in to so many systems, so many things can go wrong while that session is live, right? For example, the device that they're using may fall out of compliance, right? It could just be a matter that they have not updated the software for a long time. Or it could be that there is an active detection that there is a threat, that has appeared on that particular device that the user is using to access your critical system. You gotta turn that down like immediately, right? So how do you do that? So this is where the new work that I'm doing, it's actually no longer new. I wrote a blog about 5 years ago when I was in Google about how we need to rethink federated identity with what I coined the term called the continuous access evaluation protocol at that time. Well, it merged with another effort called RISC, which was about account security. And we formed the Shared Signals Working Group in the OpenID Foundation, which I'm a part of. And as a result, CAPE now stands for Continuous Access Evaluation Profile of the Shared Signals Framework, right? But what CAPE does is something very interesting. It gives you the ability to communicate any kind of change to the session state instantaneously. And the Shared Signals Framework provides an asynchronous transport that is reliable. And so you are assured that when you're sending a message, that the recipient is going to receive it. And the Shared Signals Framework also gives you very good controls over the negotiation of that channel, so that you can decide, which receiver gets which information about which subjects and all those things. It's very expressive. Obviously, as a result of all this, expressiveness, a collective work of a lot of people involved in the industry, we are now seeing implementations announced by major players like Apple and Okta and many others. We are actually having a interop event in the Gartner conference in December, where we now have 13 committed organizations, including Google, IBM, Cisco, and all these that are mentioned here. Obviously, our company Signal is a part of all that. But let me explain in a nutshell what CAPE is, right? So if you see the bottom two boxes, you'll see the one on the left is the transmitter, one on the right is the receiver. What they do is they establish a stream between themselves using the Shared Signals Framework API, right? And once that stream is established, now you have a reliable transport for sending asynchronous events from the transmitter to the receiver, right? Now, what are these events? These events are basically JOTs, JSON Web Tokens, but the JOTs are profiled by a spec in the IETF called the Security Events Specification. And the security event, security event token is what adds the event to that JOT. And then CAPE further specializes those events to be specific to session security. Like you have events like session revoked, you have events like assurance level change, you have events like token claims change. So you can modulate, what CAPE basically enables you to do is you can modulate the properties of a live session, including terminating that session when you're executing the when the user is actually using your services, right? So basically, what you can do with CAPE is you can one immediate thing which, for example, Microsoft implemented something known as continuous access evaluation, which is not quite the standard, but because they implemented before the standard actually got finalized, there's a little bit of different, but they had the intent of implementing the standard. They've implemented it internally between sort of Microsoft Entra ID, Exchange Server Online, and Teams, which are their most popular services. And what they've been able to do as a result of that is that they've been able to extend their token lifetimes, which used to be just 1 hour earlier, to 24 hours now, right? And so what they can do is, if something goes wrong, they can send a CAPE event from the transmitter to the receiver to say that, oh, okay, this user session should be revoked. And so then Teams will send that user back to Entra ID for re-authentication, right? So the killer app essentially has become the ability to revoke live sessions using CAPE. Now, there's also the other way of, it doesn't have to be that your identity provider has to be the transmitter and the application has to be the receiver. You can also have a situation where the application determines that there's something wrong with the session. Why is this user downloading all kinds of data? That's highly unusual behavior, which is consistent with the potential attack, and so we need to shut this session down. So the application can actually send a session revoked message back to the IDP. So there's There's no need for this always to be like coming from an IDB or anything like that. It's a multipolar world. You can have a device management system saying, I no longer trust this device, revoke the session, and things like that, right? So CAPE is a very sort of, you can say, non-prescriptive standard. It only describes what the transmitter believes. There's no requirement on the receiver that you need to act in a certain way, which has also led to its popularity, because now you can receive an event and you can make your own decisions about what to do with that event, right? And it all depends upon how much you trust the transmitter, what you trust them about, and all those things, right? So while this is a great new technology that you might have, which is, is going to solve all the world's problems, there's a challenge that, not everybody supports it today, right? While we have reports like the CSRB report that came out in the spring this year, which is really one of the, I think, recommendations they make is, people should be adopting the shared signals and CAPE standards. But while you do that, you need a transition layer. Thank you for the claps. While you do that, you need a transition layer where something can actually act like a CAPE, receiver or transmitter, and use the existing proprietary mechanisms to be able to enforce what you would ultimately do with the standard. So with this, I would like to conclude that, the future of identity, I believe, of course, identity is increasingly a part of security more than a separate thing of its own, because most attacks now involve identity compromise. And so if you want to secure identities, or if you want to secure your enterprise, it has to be a continuous process. It cannot be something that you just enforce at admin time, which is when sort of an administrator decides that some user should be a part of some role or something like that. It cannot be at login time when the IDP is actually, issuing the token. But it has to be continuous. It has to be like every access needs to be checked. Every access needs to work on the latest information that you have. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. So we still have plenty of time.
We do. Let's ask some questions. You don't get an opportunity like this very often. Which means someone's going to come ask a question.
They're spellbound.
Or you can ask in the app as well.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all. Sure? No? I think you
there's a question there.
Sometimes it takes some people.
Yeah, may I?
Yeah. Of course.
Yes, so probably I forgot your explanation, but I lost up your explanation. But is there any other use case other than the tell from the IDP to RP to revoke the session? So other use case do you have in your mind?
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the use cases that are possible, I mean, there are many. Like, for example, you can use token claims change, right? For example, the idea is that a user is logged into, let's say, AWS with certain group privileges, role privileges in AWS. Now the user has changed their, what they're working on. You need to remove the resources that they have access to and give them access to some other resources. The CAPE event called token claims change can help you do that. That's one example. The other example is where there is a CAPE event called session established, and there's a CAPE event called session presented, right? Now, it's really notoriously hard to detect lateral movement in the cloud, right? How do you know that the same identity is being used to log into like 50 services, in quick succession in the cloud, right? So the session presented and the session established events can tell you that information. And then somebody receiving and monitoring those events can basically say, oh, this means that a lateral movement attack is going on and I'm going to shut down the sessions, right? So these are the kinds of things that you can achieve using CAPE.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Atul, for the presentation. My question is more towards if you're going to have a transmitter and a receiver, what happens at the time of authentication or a continuous authentication on an untrusted client? So is it still going to be like the transmitter-receiver concept with an untrusted client on the server? Can you elaborate a little bit?
Right, yeah, that's a great question. The thing we are talking about here in terms of transmitters and receivers are both sort of network services. So we're not really thinking of these as, end user devices, right? So for example, For example, when let's say an untrusted client comes to the identity provider, let's say that's the transmitter, just as an example. The identity provider is going to have to determine how it is going to trust that client, right? Whether it's going to get some signals from your device management or EDR or whatever system to make sure that that client can be trusted, and then establish a session, right? Now, that EDR or that device management service can generate signals later saying that this device which used to be trusted is no longer trusted. And as a result, you can basically terminate the session if you wanted, right? So to answer your question, it's between sort of the transmitter or receiver and the client to decide the trust. But once you have a shared user between all these services, you can use shared signals to exchange events about those users.
Yeah, I just want to add another one, not trying to be difficult here,
Sure.
but for me to understand, fully sink in. If you're going to have such things, especially like, there are like, where you see like, the expressions are sent in a JOT. So let's say like session, you got to revoke a session, assuming it's no longer trusted, right? Most of the systems today, they work on either like a JOT-based or a SAML token-based or things like that. While SAML are short-lived, JOTs issued by an authorization server or possibly 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever it's configured, right? And not many of them, especially like since they're all using like by value, not the opaque ones, when you revoke it, the client may still use it because they may not come back to the server for verification. Is there any accommodation or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm going to just paraphrase that. It's a great question. I'm going to paraphrase it because what Sharath is asking is basically, hey, you might have an application that doesn't hold the session state. It only knows about the session when the session is actually presented by the client. And if between the 15 minutes that go in between one request and another, that session gets revoked, how is that service to decide that actually this session is actually revoked, right? Because the revoked token is going to be presented to you. So the protocol itself doesn't address that, but it's actually the topic of an open source project that I'm floating called the Cape Context Cache, where an application can maintain the cache of revoked sessions and then check the incoming requests against that cache to make sure that they're not allowing or modulations of that session to be used in the application.
Okay, thank you. I'll follow up with you.
Sure, thanks.
Atul, thank you again.
All right, thank you.